Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the history of yoga. With me is Dr. Debashish Banerji, who is the academic dean at the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles, as well as an adjunct faculty member at the City College of Pasadena and the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is the author of Seven Quartets of Becoming, a transformative psychology of yoga based on the Diaries of Sri Aurobindo, and an anthology about his great uncle, Rabindranath Tagore in the 21st century, and a book about his great-grandfather, the alternative nation of Abanindranath Tagore. Welcome, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Always a pleasure.
It is a pleasure to be with you. Yoga is a Sanskrit word meaning union.
Yes.
Union with the divine, or union with the deep self. It's a very popular practice now throughout the entire world.
Sure.
It originated in India. And its ancestry is, I suppose, to be honest, well in advance of historical times.
True. The first evidence probably of yoga is found in the material remains of the Indus Valley civilization, and we don't have any texts from that time. So whatever we can surmise comes to us from artifacts of those material remains, archaeological remains. And some of these archetypes are seals.
Yes.
And we find very interesting complex seals showing us evidence of yoga. We see some terracotta postures that look like asanas today. And we see seals showing us a horned man fighting with a buffalo, and also sitting in an interesting posture where he's actually sitting on his toes and pressing with his ankles on his perineum, which is the bottom part of the buttocks. And that kind of a posture is clearly indicated as a yoga posture meant with Kundalini practices.
Yes. So it's part of a Tantric tradition.
Tantric tradition. So the Tantric literature arises much later, maybe around the 4th century. These practices were probably being carried out all the way from the 3rd millennium before Christ. 5,000
years ago.
About 5,000 years ago. And they were being used to generate internal power through which these people could influence their society.
Control over animals.
Control over animals. And in a very famous seal, we find that such a figure is seated with animals around him, and also on a bench with two either deer or goats below him under the seat. This is a very interesting image which comes up later again in the context of the Buddha, but essentially it shows individuals who are gaining power, not only individual power over the animal world, perhaps over their own animal energies, but also doing it for the purpose of giving help or shelter to the poor.
Sort of like a political leader.
Like a political leader, helping the helpless, but also knowing how to keep rapacious powers in check. So we find that from a very early time. And this is also related to mother goddess worship. So one may say very early history of yoga includes an idea of the world as the expression of the mother goddess, And internal, immanent in us, is also this goddess as a energy source within us, and as a kind of a sort of a being that controls the various centers of our consciousness.
Now, you mentioned that this is prehistoric, in advance of any written descriptions, but isn't it also the case that we do have a script from the Harappa culture of the Indus Valley? We just haven't yet learned how to decode it.
That's right. In fact, all these seals have some writing on top. And the writing, the symbolism or the actual script, the icons of the writing have been studied, but nobody has come up with a definitive decipherment of these icons. So you're right that if we come up with such a decipherment, we'll know a lot more about the real meanings of these things.
And the more details about the origins of yoga, itself. But from what you're saying, it's related to a kind of shamanistic practice involving animals, involving power in the community. It wasn't a sort of otherworldly practice.
No, I agree. Yes, that's what it was, and that has continued. So that this is a certain kind of a stream or substratum of yoga, which starts at that time and continues. But other forms and meanings of yoga overlay it with time. So we have, for example, the ideas that come with the Veda. Which are cosmological ideas, new cosmologies, new mythologies. And they also have bearing on yoga, because they're talking about a certain kind of process by which we give birth to truth. And the successions of time, of day and night, and how by tapping into our divine source within, we can bring that forward and give it birth as a day, as a new day. So these kind of like moving the microcosm to the macrocosm and mapping the two begins at this time with the Veda.
Now you seem to be describing the processes involving the solar deity.
Correct, yes.
Where the solar deity is somehow more active at night than in the daytime, that we incorporate the solar deity within our being during the dark hours.
Yes, so the idea of day and night gets symbolical meanings with the Veda. One set of terms related to that is pravritti and nivritti. The term vritti is a very interesting term because it reappears, vritti, it reappears in the Yoga Sutra. You know, the very famous line, beginning line of the Yoga Sutra, which is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. It's defining yoga, but this is a much later definition. It's what is yoga? Yoga is the chitta is consciousness, vritti, which means the tendency towards activity. Nirodha means containment. So it is the containment of the tendency towards activity of the consciousness.
In other words, the quieting of the mind.
The quieting of the mind, the quieting of the automatic flow of thoughts and emotions. And
But now we've jumped forward probably several thousand years.
We have.
To Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
I agree, Jeffrey, but so to go back to the Veda and pravritti and nivritti. Pravritti means the prefix pra means towards. So again, this is an Indo-European pro, you know, to move towards. So pravritti is moving towards activity. And during the day, everything moves towards activity. Everything becomes self-revealed and moves towards activity. And nivritti is its opposite. It's the sort of moving into sleep, the moving into the cessation of activity.
Inward.
So the idea is that a certain configuration of the cosmos is born with the day, and it folds itself up and returns to its nascent condition at night. And these nights and days are repeated in the human life as lives. One life is like a day, and death is like a night, and the day returns in the next life. So we see the roots of the idea of reincarnation, for example, Or then you start having larger ideas connected with it, like the whole cosmic cycle is a day of Brahma.
Yes.
And then the cosmic cycle goes to sleep for a night of Brahma and returns. And then they'll say that Brahma's days and nights are a certain kind of unit, time unit. Many such time units exist in a single day of Vishnu. So you start getting these cosmological ideas, very interesting cosmological ideas with the Veda. And a mythology which is talking about what you said, that the activity of the solar god at night, which occurs through the form of Indra, the lord of lightnings. So he lights up the ignorance with these intuitions, insights, and we build our understanding and move towards knowledge through that.
It also suggests a sensitivity, I suppose, to dreaming reality.
Yes, it is a sensitivity to dreaming reality and messages of dreams. And then as that builds a certain kind of consciousness, awareness inside us, we start becoming aware of even greater presences, the presences of the solar gods. So they have a number of goddesses. Goddesses of intuition, goddesses of discrimination, of revelation, of inspiration. So these goddesses bring us greater knowledge. And finally the dawn goddess comes and gives us the opening to the day. And then you have the solar god himself. So it's really a solar religion, a solar mythology, which is then introverted into the processes of yoga. It's describing the processes of yoga in a symbolical fashion.
So the yoga in this very early stage then involves communion with various deities.
Yes.
And then exercises that engage the individual in the incorporation of the powers of those deities.
Yes, quite right. But you see, what happens with this mythology is that it also has a second level of operation, which is a ritual level of operation.
Yes.
We see this also in the Indus Valley. We find that some people are probably doing these Kundalini exercises, but there are also rituals being practiced, which give an exoteric manifestation to the esoteric practices of yoga. And later they'll say that there are two legitimate ways, the esoteric and the exoteric, the ritual and the yogic practice.
Yes.
So the same thing happened with the Veda. You had yogis who were taking the Veda in an internal sense, and you had rituals. And so socially speaking, these rituals start dominating the esoteric sense.
It becomes a form of social conditioning.
Correct. What happens with most religions over time. And then you have a new batch of yogis who feel that it's necessary to voice these truths in a new language. And there is a new body of literature that arises, which is the Upanishads. Say from maybe around the 10th century BC to around the 7th century BC. That's the height of this literature.
So they predate Greek philosophy.
They predate Greek philosophy. And it may very well be that some of these ideas travel to Greece.
Because, as I understand it, the Persian Empire sort of united Greece with, it extended from Greece to northern India.
Corrected. Yes. So the language of the Upanishads is very interesting because they are trying to create a language that will not lend itself to the designs of power. In other words, mediators, which is what happens with the Veda, where the Brahmin becomes a mediator.
Right.
And you start having a collusion between the kings and the priests that dominate society. So Upanishads are saying you don't need mediators. You can have direct access to the truth.
It's very parallel to the distinction between the Gnostics and the Catholic Church in the European tradition.
Quite true. Yes, it's like that. So they devise now not just a kind of a means of a number of exercises to raise the Kundalini, but they're trying to come up with contemplative exercises, exercises that you can meditate on. And so we find a new kind of power of yoga, the power of meditation.
Yes.
Which comes with the Upanishads. And it's very interesting if you consider how they're doing it. They have these ideas and they become sentences that they'll ask you to contemplate. And some of them are paradoxical, extremely paradoxical. And so in a way, it's similar to what is known as the koan.
The koan of Zen.
Of Zen.
Buddhism.
In fact, I believe personally that the Zen Buddhist koan is really getting its method from the Upanishads, which traveled through Buddhism, and ultimately, they're drawing on that tradition.
Surely there's a logical link there.
Yes. So, I mean, to give you an example, there'll be a sentence like this in one of the Upanishads. It says, I'm using a translation, the one unmoving is swifter than thought. It moves ahead of the gods, though they run, and it stands still. It is very far from us, yet it is very near to us. It moves and it moves not. So now this verse is full of paradox, but they'll tell you to contemplate it. So you contemplate it, you just put your attention on it, and they create this method of the 3 steps. So Shravana, which means to hear, Manana, which means to introspect and to cogitate, and Nididhyasana, which means to come into union with, or to identify. At a certain point, the thought goes away and you experience. You have an experience. And the paradox becomes an experience. It's beyond the mind, but it is an experience.
Very much the same point of the koans in modern Zen practice.
Yes. So we find that this is an extension of yoga that takes place in the whole tradition of meditation. Later we find the post-Buddhistic period sees the appearance of teachers like Buddha, Mahavira, the Yoga Sutras, Sankhya. They're trying to use the same kinds of methods, but they're using it in an empirical way. They're starting from the bottom. They're starting from our senses.
Well, the Upanishads suggest that reality ultimately is blissful.
Yes.
That when we practice yoga, we will attain ananda, or bliss, pure bliss. That's the basis. Bottom line, everything is bliss.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
Buddha said something very different.
The very opposite. So because you're quite right. They have statements. The Taittiriya Upanishad has a statement which directly tells you that out of bliss all is born, by bliss it is maintained, into bliss it returns. The Buddha would just, in a post-Upanishadic age, I'd say maybe from around the 6th century BC, people were saying, but life is a life of suffering. How come these people are talking about bliss? There was some doubt that had entered into this scenario.
Yes.
And so new teachers were trying to start from the experience of the common person. The Buddha starts with the experience of suffering. He says, our normal experience is the experience of suffering. How can we get out of this experience? Let's talk about that, rather than start by saying it's all bliss, and you can have that bliss if you do something. Similarly, the Yoga Sutras, I believe, come at that time because it's an empiricism. It starts with Prakriti, or nature, and says, how can we analyze nature and see that consciousness is free of nature? How can we make it free of the automatisms of nature?
Now, when you talk about empiricism and a scientific approach, as I understand it, the Buddha basically taught his followers to not believe anything that he said. And in Buddhism is very clear. You have all of these teachings, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Way, and then when you get to the Diamond Sutra, it's like, well, forget all of that. We just told you that, but at this point, you have to let go of everything, start fresh, begin with your own experience, and let that tell you what is true.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a great extension of Upanishadic freedom by the Buddha, because in modern times, people like Alan Wallace have talked about Buddhism as a religious science of the mind. And I think he's right, because that's exactly what he was doing. He was saying, validate it for yourself in your own life. Don't start with a belief system. Start with the questions and the processes by which you can validate it in your own life. So I think that's a process of experimentation and reflection and validation, which is very important as a method that enters through Buddhism.
Now, some people may be confused at this point, because many people assume that yoga involves exercises and postures and, okay, a little meditation perhaps, but Buddhism is not typically in the minds of many people associated with yoga. It's like it's a religion, it's not yoga.
Yes, that's not really true as a religion. I mean, there is, of course, a religious component. And just like we talked about the Veda, or we can talk about Hinduism and the Hindu gods, a religious component comes in to create a social form, a cultural form for practitioners, lay practitioners. But again, it's really the practice of Buddhism is for the esoteric or the internal realization of what is reality, what is truth. And partly, as you mentioned, the Buddha didn't want people to have preformed notions. And he was very particular not to let people pull the transcendent into their limited finite notions. So that's why he would refuse to answer the question as to whether there was a God. And so it's a principled refusal, because it's only when you get out of the condition of ignorance that you're in a position to say something about it. And then you can't say it to people who are ignorant. They have to realize it for themselves.
And I guess that's why, similarly, the Buddha, although he talked about his own past lives, when asked directly, does reincarnation exist or not exist, he refused to answer. So what you're saying here, if I understand it, is that yoga became, in effect, a scientific practice that could be practiced in any religious culture. It involves the individual testing these things out for themselves. And while it might have to accept the milieu and the beliefs of any given culture, the fundamental principle is that one doesn't incorporate those ideas until they're confirmed.
Absolutely, yes. I think, and as we can see, it's a kind of a growing toolbox of ideas and practices, and there is a history to it, and we see that there are new things added to it. Later, there is bhakti, which comes into yoga. In other words, devotion towards a personal deity that the Gita talks about, in a very important way, as a kind of a carrier of all the other experiences. So these are, each one of these, contemplation, devotion, the exercises for power, are all various aspects of yoga that give us this very rich toolbox for spiritual practice.
So there's a sense in which even today, many thousands of years later, yoga continues to evolve. It's not a static tradition.
It's not a static tradition. There have been practitioners throughout the millennia, And even today, there are yogis that are giving new teachings, new formulations, and new practices, new ideas in yoga.
And in particular, we're going to take an in-depth look at a three-part series on the yoga of integral transformation based on the teachings of Sri Aurobindo.
Thank you. Yes.
That will be an example of a relatively recent innovation
yes,
in the field of yoga. Well, Debashish Banerji, this has been a very enlightening half hour looking at how yoga evolved from so long ago and through shamanic, tantric practices, through the Vedantic period, the Buddhist period, the period of the Yoga Sutras, and other subsequent evolutions. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for our three-part series on the integral yoga practice of Sri Aurobindo.